Thank you very much, and thank you to Gregor and Eva and Florian for organizing this, and especially to Manfred for the initial invitation. Scientists use precision instruments, and they measure things in degrees and hertz and microseconds and so on. But politicians use a simple tool. It has only two readings, for and against, yes or no. It is very primitive, often divisive, and sometimes, as we shall see, hopelessly inaccurate. Indeed, it is Orwellian, this good, that bad. So my talk today is about voting procedures used in decision making. We all know that the United States of America is now divided. But of course it is, and it's partly because they have a very divisive political structure. Their elections, first past the post, but it's almost only two parties of significance, so they're almost binary. And their decision-making in Congress, for example, is always binary. And if you have a divisive political structure, you will divide, like night follows day. And Trump is only the denouement of a divisive polity. There are lots of electoral systems in the world. Next, please. There we go. And they vary. Some are not very good, and some are a little bit better, and some are, well, sort of okay. And the choice of electoral system has a fairly large significance on the political structure that then results. And in the United States, first past the post, but only two main parties, so they have a two-party political structure. The Netherlands, with proportional representation, PR, and in one large constituency, well, they have lots of parties and a little bit of pluralism, so jolly good. And the German system, which is half first past the post and half PR, and therefore you get two big parties and two or three little ones. But the main influence on the political structure is not so much the electoral system, but the decision-making system. And again, this varies from not very good to so-so to good. And for some extraordinary reason, nearly every country in the world uses one of the worst methodologies that has ever been devised, namely binary voting. And so my talk today is going to be looking at decision-making, voting methods used in decision-making. I shall look at binary voting and its history and its failings, including some reference to the Weimar Republic. And then we'll have a look at voting theory and see how there might be other ways of identifying the democratic majority opinion, as it is called. And finally, I will conclude with some of the benefits of consensus voting. So next. So lots of countries like to call themselves democratic. And the German Democratic Republic was one of them, as we know, and North Korea is another. Basically what happens is that the party in power, the only party, chooses the candidate, the only candidate, and the people then vote candidate X, yes or no. Well, sometimes it's candidate X, yes or yes, but this system is, well, not very good. And the West also calls itself democratic, and we have elections and parliaments as well, and even the occasional referendum. And I'm talking about decision-making now. But in the West, what happens is that the party in power chooses the option, and then the people in a referendum or the members of parliament in a parliamentary vote then vote option X, yes or no. And that's not very good either. Democracy was first devised or whatever in Greece, ancient Greece, and it was men only, I'm afraid, but they went down to the forum and debated the issues of the day and resolved matters with majority votes. And there were no political parties in those days, so the men took the decisions and the executive then executed, and it worked fairly well. Majority voting was also used in China in the imperial court at about the same time, the former Han Dynasty, and history relates that the emperor usually went along with whatever a majority of his ministers had decided. And the first person, well, maybe not the first person, to note that maybe binary voting is not the most brilliant methodology was Pliny the Younger in a Roman court of law. And the accused was charged with murder, and there were three options on the table for the jury: A, B, C, acquittal, banishment, and capital punishment. And Pliny the Younger realized that if you have a binary question, like execute, yes or no, then the A and B come together and join forces and vote against C. And if you have another binary question, release, yes or no, then B and C will jump together and join forces against A. And the conclusion is if there is no majority in favor of any one option, there's a majority against every option, as was the case in Brexit. So needless to say, or maybe not needless to say, but over the years, there have been many philosophers and scientists and others who have thought about doing things in a more scientific way. And the first one was probably, well, one of the first anyway, was Ramon Llull, who spoke about preferential voting. And then Nicholas of Cusa, or Cues in the Rhineland, he actually was the first one to talk about a preferential points system of voting. And we had to wait another couple of hundred years before Jean-Charles de Borda, who was a scientist, and he did all the mathematics. He was a member of the French Academy of Sciences, and hence the name modified border count. And we sometimes don't realize today that in days gone by, people were speaking about decision-making and et cetera, in rather more detail than we do today. And this, for example, is Nicholas Cusanus, the cardinal, and he's talking about his preferential points voting and saying no more perfect system can be found. And I suspect that those words are still true today. I first started to question majority voting when I was working in Africa about 50 years ago. And was it right, for example, for Europe to give Rwanda majority rule? In 1975, I moved to Northern Ireland, and majoritarianism doesn't work here either. In fact, it doesn't work well anywhere, really. So in 2017, I went on a journey. I picked up my fold-up bicycle and traveled overland, of course, climate change and all that. And I went through Berlin and down to the Balkans and the Caucasus, which are two conflict zones that I know quite well. And then into China, into Xinjiang, which is another conflict zone, of course. And then all over Eastern China with visits to Hong Kong and Taiwan as well, more conflict there. Then I spent a few days in North Korea before coming back on the Trans-Siberian Railway to Moscow and then home. And Moscow is where I finished, so that is where I will start. And in 1985, you remember, Gorbachev came to power, and this was the end of the Cold War, and everybody thought, oh, jolly good. But the basic tenement of Western diplomacy is that we in the West know, well, everything actually, which implies that other people don't know very much at all. So lots of experts went over to Moscow to tell them what to do. And for democratization, we said, okay, well, it's quite easy, really. You have elections and you elect a parliament, and then the executive proposes legislation, and then parliament debates it and they argue all day, perhaps. But eventually they take a majority vote, and if it passes, that law can then be put into effect. So basically, we were saying, Mr. Gorbachev, you need majoritarianism, but he doesn't speak English. So we had to translate it into Russian. So we said, Mikhail Sergeyevich, pan нужен. And the Russian word for majoritarianism is Bolshevism. So we were telling Gorbachev to be a little Bolshevik. And we're all little Bolsheviks, I'm afraid. And this is despite the fact that majoritarianism all over the place has not done us much good. Northern Ireland, majority rule was the problem, still is. Britain, Brexit, what a nonsense that was. In Germany, as you know, Hitler came to power with a 2/3 majority vote. In the Balkans, all the wars in the former Yugoslavia started with a referendum. That's a quote from Oslobođenje, the Sarajevo newspaper. In the USSR, well, Bolshevism, majoritarianism, led to the deaths of up to 24 million people in the gulags. And maybe the worst example of binary politics was in China, not because the Chinese are worse than anybody else, it's just that they're more populous. But it was Mao Zedong's anti-rightist campaign, part of the Great Leap Forward in 1960, which led to the famine and the deaths of up to 40 million people. But the Chinese Communist Party uses majority voting. The Politburo Standing Committee in 1989 took a vote on Tiananmen Square. Military intervention, yes or no? It passed by a margin of 1 vote. And as a result, hundreds of students now lie buried in unmarked graves. But doubtless there were politicians in China who were saying, come on, this is a binary decision, we have to make a choice, yes or no, blah, blah, blah. And politicians all over the world do this, like Brexit, yes or no, remain or leave, same thing. Or Boris Johnson in the House of Commons, do you want my deal, yes or no? And what does yes mean? That you support his deal or that you don't want no deal? And what does no mean? That you don't support his ideal or you want Scottish independence? The whole thing is a nonsense. If you have a binary vote on a problem that is not binary, then it is an act of manipulation. In Beijing, it's murderous manipulation, and elsewhere, it's just manipulation. But even so, it is manipulation. And I would suggest that in a pluralist democracy, a controversy is never binary. Not if the democracy is pluralist, not if the controversy is real. Never. Well, almost never. And maybe there is one political question which actually is dichotomous. And that is the question which was put to a referendum in Sweden in 1955. Which side of the road shall we drive on? And you'll be delighted to hear that they had not 2, but 3 options on the ballot paper. So those who were committed Democrats, but actually on this particular question, they were a little bit indifferent, but they could still participate in the democratic process and, as it were, go with the flow. Majority rule is fine. We don't want minority rule, that's for sure, and on controversial issues, you're not going to get unanimity. So, okay, we have majority rule. But how you identify the democratic majority opinion, that's the question which I'm posing today. Majority voting is no good, and not least because if you want to identify, well, with a majority vote, then somebody has to identify that majority opinion earlier if it's going to be already on the ballot paper. But you might be able to identify a democratic majority opinion in a multi-option vote, and in a preferential vote, you can definitely identify a democratic majority opinion, perhaps, as we shall see. But politicians like binary voting because they choose the question, and in many cases, the question is then the answer, but not with Brexit. But this is why you have lots of democratic dictators. And I'm afraid the first person to dictate properly and get 100% was an Irishman, Bernardo O'Higgins, when he became El Supremo in Chile. But we see here as well that Germany, as you know, had 4 referendums. Hitler had 3 in Germany, and then the Anschluss in Austria. And this is one of the reasons why the Parliamentary Council, when it met in 1949 to draw up the Grundgesetz, the basic law, and you don't have referendums in Germany anymore, not national referendums, but you still have them in the Länder for some reason. And we come back to this, as I mentioned at the beginning, that people do look at the electoral system because that does affect what happens in Parliament and how many parties and so on, but they do not consider decision making. It's an extraordinary fact of life. So when the Parliamentary Council met to write the basic law, you then have this extraordinary quotation at the beginning, which to me is a complete contradiction. It's gobbledygook. And you get the same sort of stuff in the Belfast Agreement and Dayton and so on. This idea that majority voting cannot be questioned. You can argue about electoral systems. Oh yeah, that's fine, but you can't argue about majority voting. It is quite extraordinary, which is why we have in the basic law today, you have majority voting in the Bundestag and majority voting in the Bundesrat, and as I say, still in referendums in the Länder. And the word majority, by the way, appears 52 times. And it's through the Belfast Agreement as well. I mean, it's not a German thing, it's international. The one good thing about the basic law is, well, one of the good things is the constructive vote of no confidence. And this goes back to Weimar, of course. And if you have government A in power, and if you don't like it, you don't just say no and vote no and argue all day. Come on, let's be positive. Produce your alternative government B. And so you have not just a binary vote on government A, yes or no, but at least it's government A or government B. This is a huge improvement, which most countries have yet to take. And it's the first step towards preferential voting. So now let's look at voting theory. And as I said, Pliny the Younger was conscious of the fact that life can get complicated if there's no majority in favor of one option, and if there are lots of options on the table and so on. So there has to be some sort of structure. And he wrote 2,000 years ago that in ancient times, so he's talking about 2,500 years ago, about how to do things. And it's an extraordinary fact of life that in the intervening 2,500 years, we've invented bicycles and computers and lots of things, but we are still using the same unscientific methodology of decision making. And it works like this. If you have a committee of 3 people and they've got a problem, so Miss I moves a motion, which we'll call option A. Mr. J proposes an amendment, which, if accepted, would turn it into option B. And Miss K has her ideas as well, which is option C. And there's the status quo ante. And let's assume that they have the following sets of preferences. So the procedure is, according to the laws laid down by the ancient Greeks, and which we still have today, that the first thing you do is you choose which amendment you want. And so that's a choice between B or C. And we see, according to the table there, the first two people, Miss I and Mr. J, they both prefer B to C. So that's it. It's a perfectly simple binary choice, and we now have B. And then there's the question, well, okay, that's the more preferred amendment. Now, do we want to use it, or do we not? And so it's another perfectly straightforward binary question, B versus A. And we see that the two women, Miss I and Miss K, they both prefer A to B. So the answer is A. And this is what we call the substantive. And then the final procedure is to take a vote between this substantive and the status quo, which is between A and D. And we see Mr. J and Mr. K and Miss K both prefer D to A, so the answer is D. So this is the democratic choice of these three people by 67%. So who could possibly argue with that? Well, everybody could actually, because if we look at that table, all three of them prefer C to D. So binary voting is not only primitive and divisive and Orwellian, it is also sometimes wrong. It produces the incorrect outcome. The answer is fake, to coin a phrase. If we also look at this table a little bit more closely, the table of preferences, we see that A is more popular than B, and well, B is more popular than C, and C is more popular than D, and you go round and round in circles forever. It is called a cycle, or the paradox of binary voting. And it basically means that no matter what outcome you get from whatever dubious process some devious politician has concocted, that there will always be a majority in favor of something else, as was the case in Brexit. So maybe multi-option voting would be a better way of doing things. And as we said, there are quite a few ways of doing things. A plurality vote, that's not very good, because it might only give you the option with the largest minority. It might not be a majority at all. But the two-round system, oh yeah, that definitely gives you a majority opinion. Whether it's the right majority opinion or not is debatable, but never mind. But it's definitely a majority opinion. Approval voting is a bit fluffy, as we shall see, and range voting is unscientific. The alternative vote, the Americans call it ranked choice voting. Yes, this definitely gives you a majority opinion. And we Irish call it single transferable vote, is what we use in our electoral system. And then the other two methodologies, the modified border count and the Condorcet rule, yes, they definitely give a majority opinion, perhaps. So let's have a look at another example just to compare them all. And I've chosen a very contentious problem here, because the first 6 voters have preferences A, D, C, B, and the next 4 voters have the exact opposite, B, C, D, A. And the other 5 people don't like either of those ideas, A or B, and they've got their own suggestions. So we have option A is very divisive. 6 think it's the best, but 9 think it's the worst. B is fairly divisive, and maybe C or D best represents the collective will. So what are we going to do? Well, we might as well be democratic and take a vote. If we take a plurality vote, then we only look at the first preferences, and A gets 6 and more than anybody else, so the winner is A. In a 2-round vote, you start with the plurality vote, and if nothing gets a majority in the first round, then you take the 2 leading options from that first round, which is A and B. And if everybody keeps their preferences as they are at the moment, then B wins the second round by 9 to 6. And 9 is a majority. Jolly good. In the alternative vote, or ranked choice voting, you again start with a plurality vote, and if nothing gets a majority, then you eliminate the smallest one, which is D. It only got 2 votes. And those 2 votes are transferred to its second preference, which is C. So the second round score is A6, B4, C5. Still nothing with the majority. So option B is now eliminated, and its 4 votes go to its second preference, which again is C. So the winner is now C on a score of 9. And in the modified border count, first preference gets 4 points, second gets 2, third gets 3, fourth gets 1. You add up all the points, and the winner is now D. So the question was, do you want A or B or C or D? And the answer is, we want A or B or C or D, and it depends upon the voting system used. And if we just look at the other voting methodologies that we spoke about, approval voting, it is a bit fluffy. You don't have preferences as such. You can vote for something if you think it is brilliant, or if you think it's pretty good, or if you think, oh, all right. And so it's a little bit unscientific. And different people will have different incentives for voting. And also, it has different ways of analyzing itself. Sometimes they take the first and second lot of approvals, sometimes the first and second and third. And if you do things in a different way, you might get a different answer. So it is very fluffy. Range voting, the individual is given, say, 10 points, and they can do with those 10 points what they will. It basically encourages the intransigent to be even more so, and deserves no further consideration, I would argue. Condorcet is the last one. And it's a bit like a football league. If you have 4 football teams, then the best thing to do is to let them each play each other and see which wins the most matches. And with a Condorcet count, you let everybody cast their preferences, and then you compare the 2 options at a time. A and B, A and C, is C more popular than D, and so on. On this occasion, D wins the most with 3. So the outcome is MBC, or with Condorcet is D. And these 2 methodologies are the only 2 which always take all preferences cast by all voters into account. And they are, I would argue, the most accurate. Not only that, you have, well, in binary voting, as we know, it's A or B, and that's that. And there's not much choice. In multi-option voting, well, if you have 3 options, there are 3 ways of voting, which is a bit better. And in preferential voting on 3 options, well, you've got ABC and ACB and BAC and so on. There are 6 ways of casting all preferences. With 4 options, there are 24 ways. With 5, you have got 120 different opinions and nuances that may be expressed. We are talking about precision, and we can relish the diversity of the human species. And it might also spell the end to the party whip system, which might not be a bad thing. So if we have a look at the way we do things in a consensual polity, okay, there's a problem. So somebody suggests option A, and other parties might like to amend it or tweak it or have a completely different idea. Okay, jolly good. Let them put forward complete packages. So it's an option. You're not just trying to amend this little bit, yes or no. You're putting forward a complete proposal. And it might just be tweaking a little bit, and you just highlight the difference, and it's fine. But everything is a complete proposal. And you then have a debate. And in a parliament of 6 parties, you might have 6 options on the table, and well, okay, jolly good. And then during the course of the debate, you can tweak things or amend things or composite things if 2 options are fairly similar. You might even get to the stage where you want to delete something. But this only happens, you don't change anything unless the original proposers of that particular option agree to that change. But at least you allow the debate to proceed. And majoritarian debates, you tend to return to the original motion the whole time, and you go around in circles. But in a consensus debate, you do proceed, and you might finish up sometimes with only 1 option on the table, in which case that's a verbal consensus, and we can all go home. But it's probably more likely that there might be a little bit of disagreement, in which case the president of the Bundestag can draw up a ballot, and then the members of the Bundestag vote and cast their preferences, and then the executive executes, and that's their job. The modified Borda count has the ability to identify the option with the highest average preference. And an average, of course, involves everybody, every member of the Bundestag, and not just a majority. So we're talking about power sharing. And the people elect the parliament, ideally with preferential PR, and then the parliament elects the cabinet, again, preferential PR, and then parliament makes its decisions by modified Borda count, and the executive then executes. And it's similar in referendums. You just have an independent commission, like the one in New Zealand in 1992, and they take public hearings and blah, 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 and draw up, again, a multi-option ballot. And the important thing here is that the choice of options must be independent of the executive. It's all part of separation of powers. And the consequences of power sharing would be considerable. In Westminster, it would mean that no longer could the DUP, this tiny little party from Northern Ireland, only 1% of the members of Parliament, and they had influence far out of proportion to their representative due. And it's the same with Jewish Home in Israel, or Yamina as it's now called, and so on. You would get parties who are big enough, yes, they would be in power. So in Dublin, you would have Sinn Féin sitting at the table. In Ankara, you would have the Kurds. And in Berlin, you would have the AfD. Now, some people might think, well, this is a bit sort of going too far. But my contention is that, well, the cabinet is working in consensus. So if you're going to be in cabinet, and if you're going to be effective, and you're not going to be re-elected unless you're effective, then you have to moderate your extremism. And this is the hope of democracy, if you like. And we already see that the AfD popularity is beginning to go down. Democracy in Germany, we can say, is winning. But what we could say, in a consensus democracy, it would win even more quickly. And with climate change and rising sea levels, Europe is likely to see a wave of immigration that will far outdo whatever happened in 2015. It is likely that democracy, if we retain democracy as its majoritarian democracy, the current structures, it is likely that democracy will not survive, and nor might we. But COVID is telling us that we have to cooperate. And what I'm suggesting is that a consensus polity is actually a better way of cooperating, and it might even be a sine qua non of our collective survival. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Peter, very much.